The spring rain tapped against the windows of the old brownstone on Maple Street. Inside, 3 grown children stood in their late mother's basement, surrounded by boxes and furniture that held 87 years of memories. Their mother, Dorothy, had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks earlier, and now came the difficult task of sorting through everything she'd left behind. "I don't even know where to start," said the eldest daughter, wiping dust from her hands. The basement smelled of old wood and dampness, that peculiar scent that only comes from decades of storage and neglect. Her younger brother pointed to the far corner, where a massive shape sat covered by yellowed bedsheets. "What about that thing? It's taking up half the room." They pulled away the sheets, revealing what had once been a grand piano, but calling it grand now seemed almost cruel. The wood was scratched and faded, covered in a thick layer of dust that made them cough. Several keys were chipped or missing entirely, and when the youngest sister pressed down on middle C, it produced a sound like a dying cat. The strings inside had rusted, and you could see water damage on the wooden frame where the basement had flooded years ago. "Mom never even played this thing," the brother said, shaking his head. "I remember asking her about it when I was a kid. She said it belonged to the previous owner and just came with the house." "How much would it cost to move something this big?" the eldest asked, already dreading the answer. They looked it up on their phones. The estimates made them wince. Moving a piano this size would cost at least $1,500, maybe more given the narrow basement stairs and tight corners. And that was just to get it out of the house. If they wanted to donate it somewhere, they'd have to pay even more. "Nobody's going to want this broken old thing," the youngest said, running her finger along the dusty lid. "Look at it. Half the keys don't work. It sounds terrible. And it probably hasn't been tuned since before I was born." The brother nodded toward the corner where they'd stacked things for disposal. "The junk removal company comes Thursday. Let's just add it to the pile and be done with it." It seemed like the only practical choice. They had jobs to get back to, families waiting at home, and this basement wasn't going to clean itself. The piano was just another piece of old furniture, taking up space and costing money they didn't need to spend. They threw the sheet back over it and moved on to sorting through boxes of old clothes and books. That might have been the end of the story. The piano would have been hauled away, probably broken apart to fit in a dumpster, its pieces scattered across some landfill. But sometimes luck works in mysterious ways. The family had hired Thomas, a local estate sale organizer, to help price and sell some of Dorothy's belongings. He'd been doing this work for 15 years, ever since he'd retired from teaching high school music. He had a good eye for what might be valuable and what was truly just junk. On Tuesday afternoon, 2 days before the removal company was scheduled to arrive, he let himself into the brownstone with the key they'd given him. Thomas moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, making notes on his clipboard. Depression-era glassware in the kitchen cabinets. Some nice quilts in the linen closet, decent china that might fetch a few dollars. Nothing spectacular, but enough to make a small estate sale worthwhile. Then he headed down to the basement. The space was dimly lit, with just one bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Thomas pulled the chain and surveyed the remaining items. His eyes swept past the boxes and old furniture, then stopped on the sheet-covered shape in the corner. Something about the proportions caught his attention. He walked over and lifted the corner of the sheet. Even in its sorry condition, Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He'd been around pianos his whole life, first as a student, then as a teacher. He knew the difference between a cheap upright and something more substantial. This was definitely something more substantial. He pulled the sheet all the way off and bent down to examine the instrument more closely. The dust was thick and the damage was obvious, but underneath it all he could see quality. The legs weren't the simple straight posts you'd find on a factory piano. They had carved details worn smooth by time but still visible. The music desk had delicate scrollwork, and the sheer size of the thing suggested it was a full concert grand, nearly 9 feet long. Thomas opened the lid that covered the keys. Most of them were there, though several were chipped or discolored. He pressed one gently. The sound was awful, barely a note at all, but the mechanism still worked. The hammers inside still moved. This piano wasn't dead. It was just sleeping. He got down on his knees, ignoring the protest from his bad hip, and looked at the front panel. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, directing the beam into the gaps and corners. There had to be a maker's mark somewhere, a serial number, something that would tell him what this actually was. And then he found it, stamped into the metal plate above the strings. Barely visible under decades of tarnish and grime were letters that made him sit back on his heels in disbelief. He cleaned the area with his sleeve and looked again, just to be sure he wasn't imagining things. He wasn't. Thomas stood up quickly, nearly tripping over a box in his excitement. He pulled out his phone and called the eldest daughter. She answered on the third ring. "Hi, Thomas. Did you finish the inventory?" "Not exactly," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "That piano in the basement. The one you're throwing away on Thursday. I need you to hold off on that." "Why?" "It's just a broken old piano. We looked at it. It doesn't even work properly." "I understand it looks that way," Thomas said carefully. "But I think you should let me bring in someone to look at it first. Someone who knows pianos. Before you make any final decisions." There was silence on the other end. He could practically hear her weighing the options. Time was money. The removal company was already scheduled. They'd already spent weeks dealing with the estate. "Thomas, we really just want to get this done. Moving that thing would cost a fortune, and nobody wants a broken piano." "I know a piano restorer," he said. "Just let her take one look. If she says it's nothing special, you can throw it away with my blessing. But if I'm right about what I think this might be, you're going to want to know." "Trust me." Another long pause. Then finally she sighed. "Fine. But she needs to come before Thursday morning. That's when the removal company arrives." "She'll be there tomorrow," Thomas promised. "And thank you. You won't regret this." He hung up and immediately dialed another number, his fingers shaking slightly as he did. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "Catherine, it's Thomas. Remember how you're always telling me to call you if I ever find something interesting? Well, I need you to clear your schedule for tomorrow morning. I think I just found something you're going to want to see." Catherine drove through the Brooklyn streets the next morning with her coffee getting cold in the cup holder. She'd been up since 5, unable to sleep after Thomas's cryptic phone call. In her 20 years of restoring pianos, she'd learned not to get her hopes up. People always thought they had something special gathering dust in their attic or basement. Usually they were wrong. She'd seen hundreds of pianos that owners swore were priceless antiques. Most turned out to be mass-produced factory models from the 1950s or 60s, worth maybe a few $100s if they were in decent shape. The ones in basements were almost always ruined by water damage and neglect. She'd learned to manage her expectations years ago, but Thomas wasn't like most people. He knew music, knew instruments, and he didn't get excited easily. The tremor in his voice last night had been real. So here she was, driving across town on a Wednesday morning instead of working on the upright she had waiting in her workshop. She pulled up in front of the brownstone at exactly 9 o'clock. Thomas was already waiting on the front steps, pacing back and forth like a nervous cat. "You're going to think I'm crazy," he said as she got out of the car. "I already think you're crazy," Catherine replied with a slight smile. "That's why we're friends. Show me this piano." They walked through the house and down to the basement. Catherine had been in hundreds of basements just like this one. Dim lighting, musty smell, concrete floors that had cracked over the decades. She'd learned to watch her step and bring a good flashlight. Thomas led her to the corner where the piano sat, still partially covered by the dusty sheet. He pulled it back with an almost ceremonial gesture, like a magician revealing his final trick. Catherine's first thought was that it looked worse than she'd expected. The finish was shot, the keys were damaged, and she could see rust on the exposed metal parts. But then her trained eye started picking up details that made her pause. The case style, the leg design, the sheer size of the instrument. She walked around it slowly, not saying anything, just looking. Thomas watched her, barely breathing. He knew better than to interrupt when she was working. Catherine knelt down and opened the bottom panel, shining her flashlight inside. She examined the plate, the pin block, the way the strings were arranged. Her fingers traced the edge of the soundboard, feeling for cracks and separations. She stood up and carefully lifted the lid that covered the keys, testing several of them despite their terrible sound. Then she got down on her knees and looked at the front of the piano, right where Thomas had found the maker's mark. She pulled out a small brush from her bag and gently cleaned away some of the grime. The letters became clearer. She sat back on her heels and let out a long, slow breath. "Thomas," she said quietly, "where did this family say they got this piano?" "It came with the house. The mother bought the place back in 1968. The previous owner had died and his estate sold everything as is. She never knew much about it. Catherine nodded slowly, still staring at the instrument. Do you know what this is? I was hoping you'd tell me I wasn't seeing things. She pointed to the partially cleaned maker's mark. This is a Steinway. Not just any Steinway. Look at the serial number. Look at the construction details. This is a Model D Concert Grand. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I thought so, but I couldn't believe it. Believe it, Catherine said, standing up and brushing the dust from her knees. These instruments are 9 feet long and weigh about 1,000 pounds. They're what concert pianists play in major halls around the world. New ones cost over $100,000, and this one? Catherine walked around the piano again, her mind racing through calculations. If I'm reading this serial number correctly, this was made in the early 1920s. That makes it over 100 years old. But here's what's really interesting. She pointed to some details in the construction that Thomas couldn't quite make out. See this ornamental work? These decorative elements? Standard Model Ds don't have this level of detail. This is custom work, which means this wasn't just a regular production piano. Someone special ordered this. How special are we talking? Special enough that someone paid a fortune for it new. Special enough that it was probably played in concert halls. And special enough that I need to do a lot more research before I can tell you exactly what we're dealing with here. Thomas's hands were shaking slightly. The family wants to throw it away tomorrow morning. Absolutely not, Catherine said firmly. I need to examine this properly. I need to check my records and databases. I need to find out who owned this originally and how it ended up in this basement. She paused, running her hand along the dusty lid. Thomas, this piano has a story. I can feel it. Can you restore it? Catherine was quiet for a moment, assessing the damage honestly. The wood damage is significant but manageable. The strings all need to be replaced. The pin block might be salvageable. The soundboard has some cracks, but I've seen worse. The action needs complete rebuilding. She looked at Thomas. It would take me months, maybe close to a year, and it would be expensive. But you could do it? I could bring it back, she said with certainty. It won't be easy and it won't be cheap, but yes. This piano can sing again. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures from every angle. Close-ups of the serial number, the decorative elements, the damage, the overall structure. She'd need all of this for her research. I need to talk to the family, she said. Today. Thomas called the eldest daughter, putting the phone on speaker. Catherine explained who she was and what she'd found. She was careful not to oversell it. She explained the damage, the cost of restoration, the time it would take. But she also explained what they had sitting in their basement. How much is it worth? The daughter asked. The practical question they always asked. In its current condition? Maybe $20,000 to the right buyer. Fully restored? Catherine paused. Possibly 10 times that, depending on its history. But I won't know for sure until I research the provenance. There was silence on the other end of the line. Catherine could hear muffled voices as the daughter talked to her siblings. Finally, she came back on. What are you proposing? Let me buy it from you, Catherine said. I'll pay you fair market value for its current condition. I'll handle all the moving costs. And I'll take on the restoration project myself. Why would you do that? Catherine looked at the battered instrument and smiled. Because this piano deserves better than a landfill. Because somewhere in its history is a story worth telling. And because bringing instruments like this back to life is what I do. More muffled conversation. Then, we need to think about it. Can you give us until tonight? Of course, Catherine said. But I need an answer before that removal company shows up tomorrow. After they hung up, Thomas looked at Catherine with concern. What if they say no? She was already making notes on her phone, listing the supplies she'd need, the specialists she'd have to call, the research she'd have to do. Then I'll offer them more money. Thomas, I've been doing this long enough to trust my instincts. This piano is special. I just need to figure out exactly how special. She took one last long look at the dusty, damaged instrument sitting in the dim basement. Somewhere under all that neglect was a treasure. She could almost hear the music it had once played, the concerts it had given, the hands that had touched these keys decades ago. Call me the second you hear from them, she told Thomas as they headed back upstairs. This piano isn't going to any landfill. Not if I have anything to say about it. The call came at 7 that evening. Catherine had been sitting in her workshop, pretending to work on a small upright but really just staring at her phone. When it finally rang, she nearly dropped it. We'll sell it to you, the daughter said without preamble. $22,000. And you handle everything. Catherine closed her eyes in relief. Deal. I'll have the papers drawn up tomorrow and arrange for movers. There's one condition, the daughter added. If you find out anything about its history, about where it came from, we'd like to know. Mom lived with that piano for 50 years and never knew its story. It feels wrong not to find out now. I promise, Catherine said. Whatever I discover, you'll be the first to know. 3 days later, a specialized piano moving crew carefully transported the Steinway to Catherine's workshop. It took 6 men and nearly 4 hours to get it out of that basement and onto the truck. Catherine followed behind in her own car, as nervous as a parent watching their child ride a bike for the first time. Her workshop was a converted warehouse in an industrial part of town. High ceilings, good lighting, and enough space to work on multiple instruments at once. The movers positioned the Steinway in the center of the main floor, where Catherine would have room to work from all sides. After they left, she just stood there looking at it for a long time. Now came the real work. She started with documentation. Before she touched anything, she photographed every inch of the piano. Every scratch, every water stain, every broken key. She measured everything, noted every detail. This was standard practice, but it also felt important for this particular instrument. She had a feeling this piano's story would matter. Then she began the careful process of disassembly. The music desk came off first, that decorative panel above the keys where sheet music would rest. As she lifted it away, something fluttered to the floor. Catherine bent down and picked up a yellowed piece of paper, folded many times to make it small. Her heart began to pound as she carefully unfolded it. The paper was brittle, threatening to crack at the creases. The handwriting was faded but still readable. My dearest, it began. I played our song again tonight. The one we wrote together that autumn when everything seemed possible. The audience loved it, but they don't know it belongs to you. They don't know that every note carries your name. Catherine sat down on her work stool, holding the letter with trembling hands. She read it twice, then 3 times. It was dated October 1943 and signed simply with the initial J. She looked back at the piano with new eyes. There might be more. Over the next 2 hours, working with the delicate touch of an archaeologist, Catherine continued disassembling the instrument. Inside the case, wedged between the wooden frame and the outer cabinet, she found more letters. 7 in total, each carefully folded and hidden away. Some were tucked under the key bed. One was wrapped in oilcloth and placed inside a hollow section of decorative molding. But the most remarkable discovery came when she removed the lower panel to access the pedal mechanism. There, in a hand-sewn cloth pouch attached to the inside of the case, she found sheet music. Not printed music, but handwritten compositions. The paper was protected by layers of waxed cloth, preserved intentionally by someone who wanted these pieces to survive. Catherine spread the pages carefully on her work table. There were 5 complete compositions, each written in beautiful penmanship with detailed notation. Some had corrections and notes scribbled in the margins. Some had 2 different types of handwriting, as if 2 people had worked on them together. The first piece was titled Autumn Convergence. The second was called Between Worlds. The music itself was extraordinary, blending jazz harmonies with classical structure in a way that seemed ahead of its time. She picked up one of the letters again and read it more carefully. The writer talked about performing at a club called the Blue Room, about critics who didn't understand what they were trying to do, about sneaking moments together when the world wasn't watching. Catherine grabbed her laptop and started searching. The Blue Room, 1940s New York. It took her 20 minutes of digging through old archives and digitized newspapers, but she finally found it. The Blue Room had been a famous jazz club in Manhattan, operating from 1938 to 1949. And there, in a 1943 review, she found a name, Joseph Hendricks, a pianist who was pushing the boundaries of jazz with unusual classical influences. The review praised his technical skill but questioned whether his experimental style would find an audience. She searched for more information about Joseph Hendricks. There wasn't much. He'd had some success in the early 1940s, released a few recordings, performed at decent venues. But by 1945, his name disappeared from club listings and reviews. It was like he'd simply vanished from the music scene. Catherine turned her attention to the letters again, looking for clues about the other person. The letters never used a full name, only my dearest or my love. But the handwritten music provided more evidence. 2 different styles of notation. Two different ways of marking tempo and dynamics. She examined the compositions more closely. Some sections were clearly jazz-influenced, with the kind of rhythmic complexity you'd expect from someone trained in that tradition. Other sections were purely classical, written with the formal structure of someone educated in European composition methods. Letter mentioned your symphony work and the conservatory. That suggested the other person was classically trained, possibly teaching or studying at a music school. Catherine started searching for female composers and pianists working in New York in the 1940s. It was harder than she expected. Women composers from that era weren't well documented, especially if they weren't famous. She went through conservatory records, concert programs, teaching rosters. Nothing jumped out at her. Then she tried a different approach. She looked at the competitions and grants awarded to composers in the early 1940s. And there, in a 1941 listing for the Presser Foundation Scholarship, she found a name that made her breath catch: Helen Winters, a composition student at the Manhattan School of Music, awarded a scholarship for exceptional work bridging classical tradition with modern American influences. Catherine searched for Helen Winters. She found a few concert programs from 1940 and 1941 where Helen had performed her own compositions, pieces described as ambitious and unconventional. Then, like Joseph, Helen seemed to disappear from public records around 1944. Two musicians, both pushing boundaries, both vanishing from the scene at almost the same time, and hidden inside this piano, love letters and secret compositions that combined their two styles. Catherine sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The 1940s, a jazz pianist and a classical composer. The letters talked about secrecy, about moments when the world wasn't watching. Joseph's letters mentioned what people would say and the price of choosing you. She pulled up one of the letters again and read a particular line that had stuck with her. They say a man like me shouldn't be with someone like you. They say we're from different worlds, but when we sit at this piano together, there's only one world and it's ours. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. Joseph had been black, Helen had been white. In 1940s America, their relationship would have been more than scandalous. In many places, it would have been illegal. The piano suddenly took on new meaning. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a time capsule, a witness to a love story that had to be hidden, a keeper of music that was too revolutionary, too dangerous for its time. Catherine looked at the disassembled instruments spread across her workshop. Somewhere in this piano's history was a complete story, and she was determined to find it. Catherine spent the next 3 weeks living and breathing the mystery. Her other restoration projects sat neglected while she dove deeper into the lives of Joseph Hendricks and Helen Winters. Every free moment was spent in libraries, archives, and online databases, piecing together fragments of two lives that history had nearly forgotten. She found Joseph's draft card first. Born in 1915 in New Orleans, moved to New York in 1936. The few photographs she managed to locate showed a lean young man with intelligent eyes, sitting at various pianos in smoky clubs. In one image from 1942, he was mid-performance, his hands blurred with motion, his face intense with concentration. Helen was harder to track. She came from a wealthy Connecticut family who'd disowned her. According to one brief mention Catherine found in a society column from 1943. The column didn't say why, just noted that Miss Helen Winters is no longer residing with her family, and her whereabouts are unknown. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Catherine had posted about the piano restoration on a forum for vintage instrument enthusiasts, carefully mentioning she was researching its history. An elderly man from Philadelphia reached out with a message that made her hands shake as she read it. My uncle knew Joseph Hendricks. They played together sometimes in the early 40s. My uncle passed away 10 years ago, but I have some of his old things. Letters, programs, photographs. I never knew what to do with them. If you're interested, I'd be happy to share. Catherine drove to Philadelphia the next day. The man's name was Robert, and he welcomed her into a home filled with music memorabilia. His uncle had been a bassist in the New York jazz scene, playing with various groups and musicians throughout the 1940s. Uncle Pete talked about Joseph sometimes, Robert said, pulling out a worn cardboard box. Said he was the most talented pianist he'd ever heard, But he also said Joseph broke the rules and that's what got him pushed out. Catherine's heart raced as Robert opened the box. Inside were photographs, old ticket stubs, handwritten set lists, and letters. She carefully went through each item and then she found it. A photograph from 1943 showing 5 musicians on a small stage. Joseph was at the piano, and standing beside him, partially obscured by shadows, was a woman with her hand resting on the piano's lid. "Do you know who she is?" Catherine asked, pointing to the woman. Robert shook his head. "Uncle Pete never said. But there are a couple letters in here that mention her." He called her Joseph's partner. Catherine found the letters. In one, Pete had written to a friend about Joseph's situation and how things are getting dangerous for him and his girl. Another letter mentioned that Joseph had stopped playing at the Blue Room after some trouble, and that he and the composer woman had gone into hiding. "What kind of trouble?" Catherine asked. "Uncle Pete never gave details," Robert said. "But you have to understand, this was 1943, 1944. The world wasn't kind to people who stepped outside the lines. And Joseph and this woman, whoever she was, they crossed some serious lines." Robert let Catherine scan and photograph everything. As she was preparing to leave, he handed her one more item, a small notebook filled with Pete's handwriting. "These are Uncle Pete's memories," Robert explained. "He wrote them down in the 90s before his health got bad. There's a whole section about Joseph. I think you should read it." That night in her hotel room, Catherine read Pete's notebook cover to cover. The section about Joseph painted a picture of a man caught between his art and his heart. Pete wrote about how Joseph had met Helen at a private concert where he'd been hired to play, how they'd discovered their shared vision for music that didn't fit into neat categories, how they'd started working together secretly, composing pieces that blended their different backgrounds. But Pete also wrote about the cost. Club owners who didn't want Joseph playing white people's music, critics who dismissed his work as pretentious. And then the night that changed everything. According to Pete's account, someone had seen Joseph and Helen together at his apartment, not just working on music but clearly involved romantically. Word spread quickly. Joseph was fired from his regular gig at the Blue Room. Helen was expelled from the conservatory where she'd been teaching part-time. Threatening letters arrived at both their addresses. "Joseph told me they had to disappear," Pete wrote, "said it wasn't safe anymore. Last time I saw him was March of 1944. He and Helen were leaving the city. He didn't say where they were going, just that they needed to start over somewhere people didn't know them." He looked scared. I'd never seen Joseph scared before. Catherine closed the notebook, her eyes wet. She finally understood why the piano had ended up forgotten in a basement, why Joseph and Helen had vanished from the public record. They hadn't quit music. They'd been forced to hide. Back in her workshop, Catherine looked at the piano with new understanding. This instrument had been their refuge, the one place where they could create together without judgment. And when they'd had to flee, they'd hidden their music inside it, preserving their work for a future that might be kinder. She reached out to genealogy databases and census records, trying to track where Joseph and Helen had gone. It took days of searching, but she finally found them. Marriage records from a small town in Vermont, dated June 1944. Joseph and Helen had gotten married under different last names, with no mention of their real identities. Census records showed them living in rural Vermont from 1944 through 1950. Joseph worked as a piano tuner. Helen gave private music lessons. They lived quietly under the radar, away from the spotlight that had burned them. Then the trail went cold. No death records, no further census information. It was like they'd vanished again after 1950. Catherine expanded her search, checking records in neighboring states. And finally, in a Massachusetts archive, she found what she'd been looking for: death certificates. Joseph had died in 1968 in a small town outside Boston. Helen had passed away just 2 months later in the same town. The address listed on their death certificates led Catherine to property records. The house had been sold to a woman named Dorothy in 1968, shortly after Helen's death. Dorothy from Brooklyn, the woman whose children had nearly thrown the piano away. Everything clicked into place. When Helen died, the estate had been sold quickly. Dorothy had bought the house with all its contents, including a piano she'd never known held such secrets. The instrument had sat silent for decades, waiting for someone to discover what it held. Catherine stood in her workshop, surrounded by the piano's pieces and the papers that told its story. She thought about Joseph and Helen, two people who'd loved music more than safety, who'd chosen each other when the world told them not to. The compositions hidden in the piano weren't just music. They were proof that Joseph and Helen had existed, had created together, had built something beautiful despite everything working against them. Catherine picked up one of the original compositions, Between Worlds, and read through the notation again. The piece moved from jazz to classical and back again, the two styles dancing around each other before finally merging into something entirely new. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary. And it had been hidden for 80 years. She made a decision then. This piano would sing again. These compositions would be heard. Joseph and Helen's story would be told, not just to the family who'd nearly discarded it, but to everyone. She picked up her phone and started making calls. To musicians she knew, to concert halls, to music historians. This story was too important to keep quiet. The restoration took Catherine 8 months. 8 months of careful, painstaking work that consumed nearly every waking hour. She replaced all 243 strings one at a time. She rebuilt the action, crafting new hammers and replacing worn felt. She repaired the soundboard, filling cracks and reinforcing weak spots. She stripped and refinished the entire case, bringing back the deep luster of the original wood. But she didn't do it alone. Word had spread through the music community about what she'd found. Other restoration specialists offered their help. A master craftsman drove up from Virginia to work on the decorative inlay. A soundboard expert flew in from Chicago to consult on the repairs. Nobody wanted payment. They all just wanted to be part of bringing this piano back to life. As Catherine worked, she kept the letters and compositions nearby, protected in archival sleeves. Sometimes she'd stop in the middle of sanding or adjusting and read one of Joseph's letters again. His words kept her going on the days when the work felt impossible. This piano holds our dreams, he'd written in one letter. Every note we compose together lives inside it. Even if the world never hears our music, the piano will remember. The world was going to hear it now. Catherine had reached out to musicians she trusted, showing them the hidden compositions. Their reactions had been unanimous. This music needed to be performed. Not just performed, but celebrated. Within weeks, she had commitments from some of the best jazz and classical players in the country, all volunteering their time. The venue had been harder to secure. Catherine wanted somewhere significant, somewhere that would honor what Joseph and Helen had created. She pitched the story to several concert halls, and finally, one said yes. Not just any hall, but one of the most prestigious in the country. They would perform Joseph and Helen's music at a special concert, with the restored Steinway taking center stage. Catherine called Dorothy's daughter to share the news. The family had been following the restoration process through regular updates, amazed at what had been hidden in their basement all those years. "My mother would have loved this," the daughter said, her voice thick with emotion. "She sat upstairs from that piano for 50 years, never knowing. I wish she could have known." In a way, she was protecting their story, Catherine said gently. If she'd sold the house differently, if she'd gotten rid of the piano earlier, we might never have found any of this. The concert was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late October, almost exactly a year after Catherine had first seen the piano in that dim basement. As the date approached, media attention grew. News outlets picked up the story. Documentary filmmakers asked for interviews. The concert sold out within hours of tickets going on sale. Catherine worked up until the last possible moment, making final adjustments to the piano's tuning and voicing. She wanted every note to be perfect. On the day of the concert, the Steinway was carefully transported to the hall and positioned on stage under bright lights. Catherine stood in the wings that evening, watching people file into their seats. The audience was a beautiful mix. Jazz enthusiasts and classical music lovers, young musicians and retired teachers, people who'd heard Joseph's recordings decades ago and never forgotten his name. Descendants of musicians who'd played with Joseph in those long-ago clubs, and there, in a reserved section near the front, sat Dorothy's 3 children and their families. They'd flown in from different parts of the country to be here. The lights dimmed. The conductor walked onto the stage, followed by the ensemble. 5 pianists would perform that night, each playing different pieces, but the first performance, everyone agreed, had to be Between Worlds, the composition that most clearly showed Joseph and Helen working together. The pianist sat at the Steinway.
Catherine held her breath.
This was the moment. After 80 years of silence, after months of restoration, after all the research and discovery, Joseph and Helen's music would finally be heard. The first notes rang out clear and true. The piano's voice was magnificent, rich and powerful and full of life. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as the music filled the hall. The piece moved from a jazz opening, playful and rhythmic, into a classical passage that soared and sang. Then the two styles came together, weaving around each other, supporting each other, creating something that was neither jazz nor classical, but something entirely new. The audience sat in absolute silence, transfixed. This wasn't just music. This was a conversation across time. You could hear two people talking to each other through the notes, challenging each other, inspiring each other, loving each other through sound. When the piece ended, there was a long moment of silence before the applause began. Then everyone was on their feet clapping until their hands hurt. Catherine saw Dorothy's daughter wiping her eyes. She saw older musicians in the audience nodding with appreciation and respect. She saw young people leaning forward in their seats, excited and moved by what they'd heard. 4 more pieces followed. Autumn Convergence, which told the story of how Joseph and Helen met. Midnight Refuge, a haunting piece about finding safety in music when the world outside was hostile. 2 voices, 1 song. A complex composition that required 2 pianists playing simultaneously. And finally, Tomorrow's Promise, a hopeful piece that imagined a better future. Each performance brought the audience to their feet. Each piece revealed more of Joseph and Helen's genius, their courage, their vision for what music could be. After the final piece, the conductor spoke to the audience. He told Joseph and Helen's story. He explained how the music had been hidden, how it had been found, how it had nearly been lost forever. He talked about what it meant that this music was being heard now, in a world that was different from the one Joseph and Helen had lived in, though not as different as everyone might wish. These compositions were ahead of their time, he said, but perhaps they're exactly right for our time. They remind us that the best art comes from bringing different voices together, that the most beautiful music happens when we stop worrying about boundaries and just listen to each other. The standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. People didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay in that moment, in that space where Joseph and Helen's music was alive and real. After the concert, Catherine stood on stage with the piano, accepting congratulations from musicians and audience members. But the moment she'd been waiting for came when Dorothy's daughter approached with her siblings. "Thank you," the eldest daughter said simply. "Thank you for seeing what we couldn't see, for knowing this mattered." "It was always there," Catherine said, touching the piano's polished surface. "Just waiting for the right moment." The younger brother shook his head in wonder. "We almost threw it away. We were going to throw it away. But you didn't," Catherine reminded him. "You made one phone call. You gave it one more chance, and that changed everything." In the weeks that followed, Joseph and Helen's compositions were recorded and released. Music schools began studying them. Jazz and classical musicians started performing them around the country. Historians wrote articles about their story. Their names, which had disappeared from history, were remembered again. The piano itself found a permanent home in a music museum, displayed with the letters and original manuscripts. A plaque told the story of Joseph and Helen, of their love and their music, of how their art survived even when they had to hide. Catherine visited often, just to see it. The piano that had sat forgotten in a basement now stood in a place of honor, played regularly by students and professionals alike. Every note it produced was a reminder that beautiful things can survive neglect, that important stories can wait patiently to be told, and that sometimes what looks like worthless junk is actually a priceless treasure. All it takes is one person willing to look closer, one person willing to ask, what if there's more to this story? One person who refuses to let something beautiful end up in a landfill. The piano had been left for dead. But a maestro had unlocked its secrets, and in doing so, had given Joseph and Helen something they'd never had in life, the chance to be heard, celebrated and remembered for the brilliant artists they truly were.